Hello and welcome to episode 34 of Toke Signals TV, where we bring you the biggest in cannabis and hemp news stories every week. I am Steve Elliott, the editor of TokeSignals.com, and I'll be guiding you through the news. Right after that we look at our Toke TV Bud Pick of the Week. We have a very good-looking strain called Chocolate OG this week. That is a hybrid of Chocolope and OG Kush. And I found this at the Northwest Cannabis Market White Center location in South Seattle. It's just $10 a gram and a great buy at that rate. The good news is you can get a quarter for less than $10 a gram. If you buy in quantity, the price comes down commensurately. You might want to check that out. Now let's do the news, shall we? Coming out of Texas this week, we have a study which confirms that legalizing medical marijuana does not increase crime. Yet more proof here that fears of legalization remain unfounded in science. Researchers at the University of Texas, Dallas, on Wednesday published an article in PLOS One that indicates that despite opponents' fears, legalizing medical marijuana does not increase crime and may actually lower some types of violent crime. The study looked at FBI Uniform Crime Report statistics on murder, rape, assault, robbery, burglary, larceny, and auto theft from all 50 states, including 11 states that legalized medical marijuana during the course of the study over a 17-year period from 1990 to 2006. Controlling for confounding factors, they found no increases in any category of offense, and even saw a slight decrease in homicides and assaults in the medical marijuana states. The study is reminiscent of a University of Chicago study that came out last year, showing that despite opponents' warnings about increases in unsafe driving behaviors, legalizing medical marijuana was associated with a drop in traffic fatalities. In addition, preliminary figures in Colorado and Washington, the two states that have legalized and regulated marijuana for recreational use, show that traffic fatalities in those two states have slightly decreased during the first full year of legalization. It must be difficult to be an opponent of marijuana reform, said Major Neil Franklin, a police officer for 34 years, now retired, who heads Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, LEAP, a group of law enforcement officials opposed to the war on drugs. They can't make arguments against legalization based on logic and facts, so they must constantly resort to fear-based hypotheticals and anecdotes that keep getting proved wrong by systematic study, Franklin said. I feel for them. I really do. In the United States this week, neurologists report medical marijuana may ease the symptoms of multiple sclerosis. Medical marijuana may be the most effective complementary or alternative medicine to ease the symptoms of multiple sclerosis, according to new guidelines from the American Academy of Neurology, which were released on Monday. The category of complementary and alternative medicines, CAM, includes non-traditional therapies often used in addition to and sometimes instead of doctor-recommended treatments. These guidelines are based on recommendations from a committee of 9 doctors chosen by the AAN, each of whom is an expert on complementary and alternative medicines. The panel looked at 291 studies covering medical literature from the past 43 years. Of those, they chose 115 studies. This is the first ever review evidence-based recommendation on the treatment of MS with CAM therapies, said lead author Dr. Vijayashree Yadav, clinical director of Oregon Health and Science University's Multiple Sclerosis Center. There were 29 different therapies included in the guidelines. 19 of those studies looked at cannabis. The new guidelines are intended to help doctors decide if CAM therapies can reduce specific symptoms or further disability, or if they make the disease worse and cause serious side effects or interfere with other MS treatments. While medical marijuana did provide some symptom relief, it also resulted in dizziness, drowsiness, and cognitive issues in some patients, the researchers noted. The federal government has stymied medical marijuana research, according to some doctors who advocate its medicinal use. The reason there's no evidence on inhaled cannabis is because it's very difficult to study, said Dr. Donald Abrams, a professor of clinical medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and cannabis researcher who was not involved in this study. The government really restricts studies of this plant. Certain forms of medicinal cannabis, oral cannabis extract, and synthetic THC could help reduce spasticity and pain, but were ineffective against tremors, the researchers found. They also found Sativex, an oral cannabinoid spray produced by the UK firm GW Pharmaceutical, helps reduce stiffness, but not tremors in MS. Sativex is currently sold in 25 countries, but not yet in the United States. Big news from Canada this week. Good news. An injunction has been granted. Patients there can continue to grow their own medical marijuana. Canadian medical marijuana patients who are currently licensed to grow their own cannabis will be allowed to continue doing so, despite new regulations banning homegrown, which start on April the 1st. This, according to a federal court judge who ruled last Friday. Judge Michael Manson granted an injunction to a group of medical marijuana patients who asked the judge to block the new rule, preserving the status quo until a constitutional challenge of the new system can be heard, reports the Canadian press. This decision is a blow to Prime Minister Stephen Harper's Conservative government's attempt to shift control of the country's medical marijuana system from the roughly 37,000 enrolled patients to the government. The Conservatives claim the current system has problems ranging from unsafe grow operations to supposed infiltration by criminals. Under the new rules, only commercial growers would be allowed to cultivate cannabis. Friday's injunction doesn't affect the new licensing system. Health Canada had ordered patients who were licensed to grow marijuana under the old rules to confirm they had destroyed their plants or they would be reported to the police. The patients, acting as plaintiffs in the lawsuit, argued the growing ban violates their right to access important medicine because cannabis is expected to be more expensive under the new system. Surprise, surprise. They also say they won't have much control over which strains of marijuana are available. Judge Matson concluded that some patients won't be able to afford cannabis if the prices increase, as they're predicted to do under the new rules. This group will be irreparably harmed by the effects of the new rules, Judge Matson said in a written decision. I find the nature of the irreparable harm that the applicants will suffer under the new rules constitutes a clear case which outweighs the public interest in wholly maintaining the enacted regulations. Health Canada projects the average price of a gram of marijuana under the new program will be $7.60. Producers will be able to set their own prices. This is well above the $1 to $4 cost that many patients have been able to achieve by growing their medicine at home. Patients who are already licensed as of September 30th, 2013 to grow their own marijuana, whether for themselves or as a designated provider for another patient, will be allowed to continue to do so under the terms of this injunction. Those patients will be allowed to possess up to 150 grams of marijuana, according to Judge Matson's decision. The Conservative government of Stephen Harper last year announced a significant overhaul of the system, including banning patient home grows, and has since been taking applications from commercial growers. In this week's court hearing, a government lawyer claimed patients have no constitutional right to cheap medicine. He went on to claim there is no scientific evidence to show specific strains of marijuana are better suited to treat particular illnesses or patients. Of course, he demonstrated an appalling ignorance of the subject in saying that. The patient's lawyer countered by suggesting the government hadn't offered any evidence that the medical marijuana system really poses as many risks as the government claims. The government argued that allowing some patients to continue growing would prevent the new medical marijuana system from, quote, fully developing. That sounds a lot like the Washington State Liquor Control Board, which earlier this year advised the legislature here in Washington to ban home growing by patients until a flood of patient protests convinced them to partially reverse that recommendation. Health Canada issued a statement following Friday's decision, saying it would continue treating marijuana as much as possible like other narcotic drugs used for medical purposes and would review the court's decision. Judge Matson wrote that the impact of his ruling will be short-lived and it won't have a major impact on the government's ability to implement its regulations. I am happy but still a little worried, said one patient and approved home grower who wanted to remain anonymous. In a year, if we just get our licenses taken away, then what was the point of this extension? It's not a victory. We won an arm wrestle, basically. Activist Dana Larson said that the last-minute reprieve has complicated matters for some patients who had already dismantled their home-growing operations. There are certainly a lot of patients who are going to be left in limbo by this decision because their license expired or because they thought this was going to happen. So in good faith, they took down their gardens and registered with one of these companies, Larson said. A trial to decide the issue hasn't been scheduled, but Judge Matson's ruling says the trial is expected within 9 to 12 months. In Washington State this week, a fascinating survey that shows 71% of residents in Washington support legal marijuana stores opening in their neighborhoods, putting the lie to a lot of town officials in Washington who are trying to ban the stores right now, saying their residents are against them. More than 7 in 10 Washington State residents support a legal marijuana business opening right in their own neighborhood. And that's according to the results of a new survey. The level of support in Colorado is almost as high. This survey of nearly 2,200 consumers from Washington and Colorado revealed what residents of both states think about legalization of recreational cannabis. 71% of Washington residents and 67% of Colorado residents support cannabis businesses opening in their neighborhoods, according to this survey. 43% said they plan to make a marijuana purchase in the future, and 70% of them believe that bringing cannabis to a dinner party will become as routine as bringing a bottle of wine in the not-too-distant future. While residents of both legal states are welcoming marijuana businesses, they do have some concerns. 43% are worried about kids having greater access to marijuana, but kids already had access, of course, under prohibition, and legal marijuana stores won't sell to them under legalization. 42% are concerned about increased numbers of people driving under the influence of marijuana, but statistics show that traffic fatalities have fallen in medical marijuana states. Only 26% of those surveyed expressed concerns about increased crime as a result of marijuana legalization. And as we learned earlier in this show, a survey released this week by the University of Texas, Dallas, confirms that legalizing medical marijuana does not increase crime. As the growing number of states with marijuana legalization ballot initiatives increases, pot is gaining social acceptance across a wide swath of demographics, even with shared concerns about kids having great access to the drug, said Lee McMillan, Vice President of Marketing and Research at Avo Incorporated. Somewhat akin to the social movement after the end of Prohibition, legalized marijuana will likely follow a similar trajectory as cannabis becomes socially accepted and new businesses emerge, she said. Even with increasing acceptance, smoking weed in front of the kids is still taboo. 89% of survey respondents wouldn't consider doing that, including 75% of those who said they intend to buy marijuana in the future. More than a third, 38% of the pot smoking population, has had or has known someone who has had legal issues as a result of using marijuana. Perhaps as a result of the convenience involved, or perhaps because of the perceived social stigma of using pot, 71% of respondents said they would consider using a private delivery service to buy and receive legal marijuana. In Minnesota, the news wasn't so good this week. We have parents slamming the governor in Minnesota for blocking popular medical marijuana legislation. HF 1818, a medical marijuana bill in Minnesota, would allow people with debilitating conditions safe access to medicinal cannabis, but to appease pot-phobic law enforcement groups in the state who are fearful of losing their fat federal war on marijuana grants. Governor Mark Dayton proposed a so-called alternative measure that would not allow any patients to access medical cannabis. Then, incredibly, Governor Dayton accused the parents and advocates supporting HF 1818 of opposing legislation that would help kids. Parents of children suffering from epilepsy slammed Governor Dayton at a news conference on Wednesday for obstructing the widely supported bill. They also called on the governor to put special needs ahead of special interests, and they criticized him for trying to satisfy law enforcement groups. These law enforcement groups have steadfastly opposed any workable medical marijuana legislation in Minnesota. They have refused multiple compromises offered by advocates and legislators, and they proposed an alternative measure that would not actually allow any patients to access medical marijuana. The governor seems to understand that medical marijuana can help children like my son, said Angela Guerin, a St. Paul woman whose son Paxton suffers from epilepsy. I hope he will do the right thing and stop blocking the bill that would actually allow them to use it. HF 1818 was introduced last year by Representative Carly Meelan, DFL Hibbing, and it would allow people who are suffering from specific debilitating conditions such as cancer, HIV, AIDS, and epilepsy to access and use medical marijuana if their doctors recommend it. The Department of Health would issue medical marijuana ID cards to patients and establish a tightly regulated system of medical marijuana dispensaries and quality control labs. The House Health and Human Services Policy Committee approved the bill earlier this month. Governor Dayton's alternative proposal would direct funding to research into the anti-epileptic properties of a specific strain of marijuana, but would not provide a mechanism for patients or their caregivers to actually obtain any marijuana. The governor has said he will only approve a medical marijuana bill if it has the support of law enforcement groups. But as we said, they have stubbornly opposed any workable compromise on medical marijuana legislation. Governor Dayton also showed enormous insensitivity to those who need cannabis medicinally by proclaiming this month that marijuana is, quote, already available for medical use in Minnesota. It's just illegal. Minnesotans with debilitating medical conditions and their families should not have to take a backseat to politics, said Jessica Hauser, a Woodbury, Minnesota woman whose son Wyatt suffers from epilepsy. It's time for Governor Dayton to put special needs ahead of special interests and support effective medical marijuana legislation. Parents of children with epilepsy informed the governor and his staff that they opposed his proposal because it would not help their children or others who could benefit from medical marijuana. During a Tuesday radio interview, Governor Dayton accused supporters of HF 1818, including the parents of children with epilepsy, of opposing legislation that would help hundreds of kids that are suffering from epilepsy. We informed Governor Dayton that we cannot get behind his unworkable proposal when there is a bill on the table that would actually help our children, said Maria Botker, a Clinton woman whose daughter Greta suffers from epilepsy. He responded by taking to the airwaves to accuse us of opposing legislation that would help our own children. For Governor Dayton to say he is working in the best interest of my daughter is disingenuous, Botker said. For him to say I am working against the best interest of my daughter is reprehensible. In Tennessee, there's also a struggle for medical marijuana, which took a big setback this week. But they are continuing in their fight for life in Tennessee to bring medical marijuana there. A bill which would have legalized medical marijuana died in the Tennessee House on Tuesday when the Health Subcommittee members voted it down 6-2. But patient advocates in the volunteer state say this fight is far from over. When the Kooser-Coon Medical Cannabis Act, House Bill 1385, failed, it was a huge disappointment for many patients who hope to soon be able to legally use the medicine that works best. Patients and families alike reported that some members of the Tennessee legislature ignored their pleas, and others went beyond that, treating patients with outright rudeness. You know, I have to say the rudeness of some of our legislators is infuriating, activist Dana Arvidsson of the group MMJ for Tennesseans posted on Facebook Wednesday. Not only do they not read our emails or listen to us, those that voted them in and can take them out, they don't even have the common decency to listen when another rep is speaking. Representative Sherry Jones, a Nashville Democrat, knowing that the bill she sponsored was about to be voted down, called out gutless fellow legislators in the committee. I know there are some of you in this room who would rather die than approve the legalization of medical marijuana and make it available to people that are seriously suffering and have a very poor quality of life, she said. While another medical marijuana-related bill, this one of the watered-down, CBD-only pieces of legislation that timid lawmakers love because it gives them the appearance of doing something about medical marijuana, a popular topic with their constituents, without taking any actual political risk, and while unfortunately helping very few patients, that is still alive in the legislature. It's still a bitter pill for activists to swallow that a real medical marijuana bill won't be happening this time around. But it will be happening. Trust me on this one. Whether it happens in next year's session of the Tennessee legislature, or even if it takes longer than that, medicinal cannabis is coming to Tennessee. How do I know that? Because I know when people are fighting for their lives, they don't stop fighting. I'm talking about people like Seth Green, 23, of Bluff City, Tennessee. Seth is battling cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, and a seizure disorder, and he's been in and out of the hospital since he was born. Last April, Seth made a Facebook post which led to his being featured in local media, on blogs, and in Sativa magazine, to testifying before the Tennessee House Health Committee, and led to attending the National Medical Cannabis Unity Conference, hosted by Americans for Safe Access, where he's been nominated for the Patient Advocate Award. Marijuana helps to manage Seth's cerebral palsy and his pain issues. His pain leads to more frequent seizures, putting his life in danger. My family doctor told me to smoke marijuana, even though it's illegal, Green wrote. I hate breaking the law, but I no longer want to live in pain. I'd like to reduce the pain the best way possible and without the use of artificial drugs that actually only cover up the disease and get me addicted, Seth wrote. Medicinal marijuana does not do either of those things. It is a cure and not a cover-up. I have a very difficult life with this cerebral palsy, Seth wrote. The pain worsens every day, and it also gets worse as I get older. Marijuana relieves the muscle tightness in my throat and chest, so I can actually breathe normally, and it reduces the anxiety attacks and seizures. With no help in sight, I've taken matters into my own hands, even if it means breaking the law, Seth wrote. I do not have the financial resources to move from the state of Tennessee. I don't know where else to turn. They threw out the herbal bill where we could use marijuana with THC, Seth told me on Wednesday. Well, now the Republicans made a bill only for oil, with it having pretty much all CBD, but it takes THC as well, Seth said. I went to personal meetings with Republicans, and they straight lied to my face. According to Green, not content with merely lying to him, some lawmakers even indulged in personal attacks against the medical marijuana bill's sponsors. Seth told me that Representative Tony Shipley, for one, made personal attacks on the bill's main sponsor and insisted he wouldn't even talk about medical marijuana until the FDA approves it. It made me so upset, he told me. It was crazy. The main sponsor told me to lay low because they might come after you. When I went to testify in front of them, I told them I wouldn't take their man-made drugs they all approve of, Seth told me. I started my own research on medical marijuana, and I got mad because of all the lies the government has told us. After Seth became aware of the facts, he took action. I started reaching out, gathering people for the movement, and started a petition, he told me. I did a medical marijuana rally, and when that was over, people got fired from their jobs just for supporting the bill. When Seth requested one-on-one meetings with his local state representatives, they refused to meet with him. They said it would be a waste of time, Green said. They all said alcohol is safer, but the one I finally had a meeting with, Timothy Hill, said he agreed with what I had to say and told me he is for medical marijuana. Lieutenant Governor Ron Ramsey says people use it just to get high, Seth told me. He has a grandchild that has cancer, but he won't help save the grandchild's life. If my grandchild had cancer, I'd do anything to get a cure. The main reason why the bill failed this year is because all the state representatives will lose 95% of their funding because they are backed by beer companies and pill companies, Green told me. We have yet another interesting scientific survey released this week with very positive results for cannabis. This survey coming from Canada, and it shows that marijuana smoking students do better in school than their tobacco smoking classmates. Students who smoke only marijuana do better at school than their classmates who smoke only tobacco or those who smoke both tobacco and marijuana, according to this new study, which tracks substance use among teens over a 30-year period. Scientists at the University of Toronto's Dalla Lana School of Public Health looked at data from a survey given to nearly 39,000 Ontario students between 1981 and 2011. Students in grades 7, 9, and 11 were asked by the Center for Addiction and Mental Health about their tobacco and marijuana use and about their academic performance. Cannabis-only users did better at school than their peers who smoked only tobacco or who smoked both tobacco and cannabis. These findings reflect the fact that fewer students smoke tobacco now than was the case 30 years ago, and those who do smoke tobacco now make up a marginalized, vulnerable population, according to the study's lead author, Michael Shaitan, assistant professor of epidemiology and public health policy. Almost all the tobacco users, 92%, also use cannabis, according to the study. However, only 1 in 4 marijuana smokers, just 25%, also use tobacco. It's better relatively, Shaitan said of marijuana smokers' academic performance. However, marijuana users didn't outperform non-users, Shaitan said, but neither did non-users outperform marijuana users. Now, there is a distinction between marijuana use and co-use with other substances, and it's an indication of the changing social norms, according to Shaitan. So it's not an absolute that they do better. It's that social norms have changed, and the population of people who use marijuana are more like the general population. This study was published in the March issue of the Journal of School Health. There was less marijuana use and more tobacco use among students when the study began back in the 1980s, and those who smoked pot tended to also smoke tobacco back then. At that time, very few tobacco users also smoked marijuana. But 30 years later, that had flipped, the researchers found. As tobacco use diminished, marijuana use increased. And among the remaining tobacco users, marijuana use was very prevalent. The effectiveness of anti-tobacco messages in recent years is one reason for the switch, according to the researchers. The population of youth smokers right now is one that is a fairly marginalized population, quite a vulnerable population. So they are at high rates of cannabis use, but also of other drugs and other behaviors, according to the researchers. This is not that tobacco is causing this. It is something that has changed socially in the role of tobacco in society, Shaitan said. I hope that you will come back and visit with us again next week and get all the latest in cannabis news. Until then, my advice to you is to stay lifted. See you next time.